right, so once you're finished building your clay, it's time to kind of do the cleaning up work. So it's about as tall, maybe a little bit less tall, but I'm okay with that, as my model. Whatever project you're doing, you're going to want to look at the requirements, look at the height requirements, and then remember that at some point, this was almost probably like this tall. So this was probably only one coil shorter. The clay shrinks quite a bit. So look at it, make sure that it's kind of what you're looking for, or at least close to it. Now it's the full cleaning up time. So here I'm going, and I'm just going to take my metal rib, and you can, remember, you can take your ID card or your key card too, and you can do this. But I'm just kind of cleaning up this edge. Think of it like spackling a wall. I'm filling all the holes at the same time as I'm taking all the extra clay off. So all that extra clay is going to be also filling the holes in the clay. Now I'm also going to want to keep checking the top. So I want to make sure that it stays round. And that's really important to me here. So I want to make sure it stays round. And then I'm going to check the inside right now. You can kind of see here. The inside is kind of wonky. It's not great. All the coils are blended. It's just not super smooth. Now, because it's kind of a weird placement, it's really hard to get your rib in there. If you've got a long pointed tool like this works fairly well, but only when it's right at the right angle. So this is a great angle here, but once I get down into my clay, it's just not a great angle. I just don't have enough space without gouging the other parts in. This is kind of where your fingers are going to be doing a lot of work. And if you have any sponge work to do, it's going to be in here. And so your sponge can do a little bit more work. I wouldn't recommend using your sponge until near the end when it's pretty sturdy and dry. Any water you add into your clay right now is kind of a weakness added to your clay. If you've got any spots where you're like, I have like maybe one part of the coil was thinner. Up here you can kind of see that, hopefully. Any spots that you see, any little gaps that you see where the clay around it can't fill, just take a tiny piece of pretty moldable wet clay, and you're going to be sticking it into the gap to fill it, and then rolling out that extra clay. So you're going to kind of just start filling it. Remember that both of them have to be in a plastic state in order to fill those holes. Once it's leather hard, you've kind of missed your window. So from here, I'm going to fill all my little holes here. You might not be able to see too well inside, but know that I am spackling, filling holes just like you fill like nail holes in a wall. Most things you make that you're going to use, you'll see the inside. So you want to make sure that the inside looks just as nice as the outside so that someone doesn't come by and say, wow, what a nice pot. And then they look on the inside and they say, never mind. You want to make sure you've taken care to all of the details inside and outside. All right, once you've got kind of all the holes filled, then it's just smoothing time. I would just take your sponge, get it just a little bit damp. And start smoothing the clay on the inside. You don't need to do this on the outside. I would only do this part on the inside because there's some other tools that we're going to use on the outside to get a really smooth effect. But right now you need the flexibility of the sponge to really clean up the inside. All right. If it's a drinking cup, you're going to want to make sure it's super smooth on the inside, just like this, so that it can be cleaned really easily. If you're using it as the luminary, you're going to want to make sure it's smooth, but it doesn't have to be as smooth as that cup there. All right, so got the inside smooth. Now I'm going to work on the outside here. Now I've got a couple tools I can use. I can use my rib and I can just keep smoothing it and going crazy, but it may not meet my model that I created. So here's where your next kind of step comes in. So it's starting to get there, maybe not quite. What I can do now is I can do something called condensing the clay. And if you've got spoons at home that are old and you don't need to use them, wooden spoons work best, but you can use metal spoons too. Just make sure that they have a really wide kind of ladle part. And what you're going to do is you're going to support from the inside. And you're going to do some light tapping. So if I'm going around, if your clay is too wet, that's why I don't want you to use your sponge here. If your clay is too wet, you'll have a hard time doing this because it'll stick the whole time. So what you're doing is you're condensing the clay. You're taking all the clay molecules that are kind of like this and you're bringing them together and you're kind of like, think about closing your fist. You're tightening those clay molecules. That makes for really strong things out of clay. Now if you're thinking, if you've got, some wiggle room, which I do, and my clay is pretty soft still, if you need to make like the collar of your clay a little bit smaller, you can do some condensing with your hands to kind of push that clay neck in. And this is where you'll want to start looking and keep measuring. So this needs to go way in. You can also, if you've got a neck like mine, you can use your dowel. To condense your clay. Now it will only go so far, so this is like somewhat right, maybe not 100%. And I can decide if this is good enough or not good enough, and I can problem solve from there. But once you get to this point, if it's not going to do in the first couple rounds of tapping, it's probably not going to go where you need it to go, which is fine for me. I feel okay. I like this overall form. So I'm going to just keep condensing my clay, going around. You can do this with your wooden tools too. It's just at a slightly smaller scale, and that's fine too. But you hear that? Those are all of your clay molecules getting closer and closer together. And as you're doing this, you're going to want to keep checking from multiple angles that you're not making one side off and then changing stuff. I like to keep the same pressure, and you can do a whole area at one time. That helps to keep the same angle, the same pressure. And you might get these lines, but they're really easy to smooth out with your finger. Your finger gets it the most smooth. All right. Once you get it to the point where you want it, and I'll have some more smoothing to do later, but I'll use my fingers to kind of smooth everything out here. My clay is pretty condensed now, so I'm just getting all of those extra lines out. I'm using my finger. You can also use your key card or your metal rib. To go ahead and smooth stuff out. All right, so I've got it to about here, exactly where I want it. Now it does flare out, so I can start to kind of mold that flare out. Any thin spots, I can just go through and I can add that clay like I was talking about and fill that hole. Just make sure you blend it all the way in and make sure both pieces of clay are in the same state. So it means they're both plastic. There we go. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I have to cut the top of my clay off. Now, it's up to you, but what I like to do is I just like to trace the top of like a piece of paper. I can wrap just like a really thin strip of paper around. So I'm just using the top part of a piece of paper, and I'm going to kind of bring it up. I can make some tears in the bottom to make it more flexible. And I can wrap it around and I want to hit it at the lowest point here. So this is probably the lowest point. And if I want it to have a super smooth exterior, I'm just going to, or smooth lip, I'm just going to make sure that it's even all the way around. Then what I can do is I can just take a really sharp knife, and I'm going to float it at the top of this. Pull these off as I go. And the paper sort of acts like a guide for you. To get the top nice and flat. Once you're done, you can pull the paper off. And you probably have a little bit more smoothing to do then. If I wanted to flare it out a little more, I could. If I were making a mug, I would want to taper the lip. But if I'm just doing a luminary, I'm just going to break the corners and make this edge here look really nice. A lot of times when your hands get really dirty, you can just wash them off, get them mostly dry. This would be a good spot for you to use a sponge as well. Once you're kind of done with all the structural stuff, you can use the sponge to get that final smoothness. And if you've got the wheel, you can sort of spin it and bring your finger out. And then this is where you can just start to thin out the lip if you need to, and make sure it's even all the way around. This is your coil pot. There you go. With the bottom, you can take the pointed part here and just go all the way around, cut that extra stuff off the bottom. And if you're struggling to unattach your clay, you can slide a knife in just on the corners, and that should help to free it, but use both hands. There we go. It should pop off, and then you'll want to smooth out the bottom and clean it up once it's a little bit more dry. You don't need to do that right now. And then you let it dry. And that is a coil pot.